Welcome to Parliament and Protests. Make sure that you are clear on what essential understandings you're supposed to get from this video. There's a lot of information here. You're not taking notes on everything, so just be clear and make sure you take good notes, and as always, pause and go back when you need to. So we'll begin by meeting King George III. Here's a painting of him made around the time we're looking at here, the 1760s. There's his home, Buckingham Palace. And remember, he drew a proclamation line along the colonial area after winning that war against the French. However, many white settlers did not follow the king's law. Now, when you see text in red like this, that's giving you a hint of why the British government did something. So there's this line, white settlers aren't following the law. So Parliament, the lawmaking group, tries to do something about that. They didn't follow the king's law, so they make their own law. This is what Parliament looked like, an engraving of the sort of setup. It's sort of like the Congress we have in the United States. A bunch of men. Here, they're all men getting together to vote. That's what it looks like on the outside. So when you're thinking of Parliament, it's a group like this. And when you see Act, that's another word for law that gets passed by the British Parliament. Okay, so there's our little bits of vocab. The one we're going to look at first, the Quartering Act. So again, in red, you've got up at the top, you've got why the British government did this act. What they've done is they send 3,000 British troops to that proclamation line, that red line there. They don't go everywhere on that line, but certain places where the law needs to be enforced. And besides that, food and forts are expensive, so part of this law is forcing colonists to quarter the troops, to house them, feed them in little inns or taverns. Not really in people's houses, but that's what colonists will be responsible for doing for their own protection. Another thing that they do, here we have, remember the huge debt after that war? England's already paying high taxes, so what's Parliament going to do? They pass a new law, which is going to be a tax on sugar and molasses, things that get imported from the Caribbean. That's what sugar cane looks like. You can see how tall it is compared to that woman walking by. Of course, sugar gets used for things like drinks and baking. Molasses, there are at least a couple of things we use molasses for. They would have used molasses for. So it's a new tax that colonists will have to pay, but it's really mostly on merchants, people who import those things. They'll have to pay the tax to get things off the ships, and then what they do is increase the price a little bit to cover the costs that they had for the tax. And this law also made it harder to smuggle. That's a great word for sneaking things in. So that Sugar Act helps a bit, but there's still lots of debt, even a year later. So here we get our clue. What's Parliament going to do for this debt? They pass something called a Stamp Act, which might not do what you think it does. This is an example of what the stamps looked like. But this is not about sending mail. This is a tax on all sheets of paper, basically all sheets of paper, all kinds of documents that are used in the colonies. So it's a tax on buying and using things, kind of like the sales tax we have today. But there'd been nothing like this before in the colonies. So it's not hugely expensive, as you see here. In the example, there's only half a penny, so they could be very small. But sometimes it was much larger for things that lawyers would have to deal with for court cases and so on. And it was enforced by colonists themselves. They would be hired to be a stamp agent. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. So that's the new law, this Stamp Act, to raise more money. However, it makes some colonists very upset, and these are some of the things they do about it. They print things in newspapers, even on teapots. That's a zoom in of what you saw on that newspaper there. So printers don't like it. That's not an actual person on that pole there. It was more like a sort of a scarecrow, sort of a doll. But it's meant to look like the stamp agent, the person who was enforcing that law. And you see they're throwing things at him, and later they might even burn that. So these are some of the ways people would protest. So we'll show you more ways in a moment, but just to be clear, what the problem would be, it's a small tax that you don't have to pay. You could just avoid using paper. You don't need it. And actually, they even got a warning months before it would actually go into effect. But really, the reason is the colonists didn't have a vote in the British government. And that parliament there, not a single person there is from the colonies. They're all from England. So these are some of the kinds of things some colonists would feel. They would feel it's unfair. They didn't get a say, a vote, and they were left wondering what's going to happen next. And the biggest impact is on printers and lawyers, those people who use paper, and we'll see why that was a problem for the British. So just a reminder of the different kinds of ways, just little illustrations of those, some of those different kinds of protests. We saw these before. So those protests, the combination does end up working, partly because merchants in Britain are getting affected by those boycotts, so they try to get their government members to make a change. Some people in Parliament get persuaded by the arguments that they hear from like the Stamp Act Congress. Not everybody, though. Not everybody's pleased, especially those riots do bother some of the people in Parliament and in England and in the colonies, actually. Uh, but Parliament does repeal those taxes. Parliament repeals them. Remember, here's Parliament, that whole group of guys there. They repeal the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act. That means to cancel them. Basically, they pass a law to cancel the law. However, at the same time, same day, they pass something called a declaratory act that declares that Parliament has the right in all cases whatsoever to make laws in future, whether taxes or, well, in all cases, anything they think they need to, they're still declaring they have the right to. So, happy baby meme saying, success, we worked, it did it, or did it? See, that's what the question mark there means. Maybe this wasn't quite so successful. The main problem hasn't been solved yet. There's still a lot of debt owed by Britain 4 years after that war. And some new guys have been elected to Parliament, and they've got some new ideas of their own. One of them is this lovely looking gentleman here. His name is Lord Charles Townshend, and he pushes through some laws that get named after him. One of these is a new set of taxes. Those ones have been repealed before, but now there's a new set of taxes on pretty much all imports, pretty much everything that they're bringing in to the colonies from England. Glass, they can't make themselves. Paint, they can't make themselves. Metal, that they can't make for themselves. And other things as well. They're going to have to pay an extra tax in the colonies. Another one of these Townshend Acts means that any officials can enter your home and search your home looking for illegal goods or things that have been smuggled. There's that word again. So to make sure these taxes are being paid, officials can break into your home anytime and make sure that you don't have any of these illegal items. That's another thing that the colonists are being forced to do that they weren't being ordered to do before. And a third one of these acts limits what New York's colony government can do. They weren't obeying the Quartering Act. They weren't helping make sure that soldiers would get housed and fed. So now that assembly can't meet until they do what they were told. Well, what are the colonists going to do about that? Well, let's look at the high level kind of approach. Actually, not really much. They don't really do much of anything about this one, but some join that Sons of Liberty, that mid-level kind of way of protest. The Sons of Liberty get back to work in Boston and other cities. They're going to do more parades and more of what they were doing before, even bigger boycotts of British product, the things that seemed to work before. At the low level, they get fired up again, and you get more street riots, things that look like this. Again, they're not out to kill everybody, but definitely public kinds of demonstrations and all sorts of stuff going on, and pictures like this, more of those dolls getting burned. And that message is going to get right back to England. They'll find out about the protests, the parades, the riots. What are these guys going to do about that? They've already set up some laws with the King's permission and Parliament's voting. What are they going to do now? Well, here's what they're going to do. They send a few thousand troops, soldiers to Boston to stop all this nonsense of parades and riots and so on. So those ships down below are the ships of soldiers coming in and getting rowed along, and right down the middle you can see all those red coats of uniformed officers and soldiers about to go to work and stop Boston from all this craziness. And here's a map of what Boston looked like at that time. It was right in the middle, near where it says Boston Harbor is where those ships were coming to. Those soldiers march right to the middle, and a lot of them will stay in the green area, Boston Common, and that's where they'll be for quite a while. There are no major events to report in the year 1769, but tension is building between those soldiers and the common people, and neither one really wants to be there. Some of the soldiers aren't getting paid as well as they want. They're trying to get extra jobs, which means they're taking work from men who live in Boston, and you get a lot of disrespect building up on both sides, and that's going to build up and up and up, but it's going to bust through. And that event we call the Boston Massacre. That's what it was called at the time, and a year later, 1770. Here's one picture that you might have seen of this rather violent event. Here's another picture of that event, and here's another one that you may have seen of this event. There are a lot of mysteries of what really happened at the Boston Massacre. However, these are the facts that we do know that you should make sure that you remember. Where it happened was near the tax collection building in the center of Boston. This happens in the evening, well after dinner time, but before bedtime. And we know that a squad of British soldiers, a number of British soldiers, fired into a crowd of Boston residents. 5 of them that were shot died. Many more of them were wounded by what happened at the Boston Massacre. These are the facts that we know. However, and there were at least 2 injured soldiers. We should mention that part as well. However, there are some questions that we should ask, that we should wonder what really happened before the guns fired, what made the soldiers shoot at the crowd, and who is ultimately responsible for what happened. That's some questions that we'll leave you with at the end of this. This is the end of the video.